Ben, let me just give you one last example in terms of my experience. And I won't name names because the students will get mad at me. But I asked them at the beginning of the semester how many of them, and I probably should have waited so that they have confidence in me and whatnot, but how many of you have AI girlfriends or AI boyfriends? And they all kind of snickered. They all kind of chuckled, you know, and nobody raised their hand. Later, in office hours, I found that when they were alone with me, they said, I spend roughly 2 to 3 hours a day chatting with an AI, usually at nighttime. And they think at the beginning, they think it's a cure for loneliness. But as time goes on, they realize it's not.
Father Philip, Matthew, it's wonderful to have this ability to have a conversation with both of you here in studio in Rome. And so, Matthew, I'd like to begin with you. There is so much change going on right now in AI. It feels like every single day there's a new update, there's a new technological innovation that is blowing our minds, that's breaking all the previously expected records or or capabilities of where we would think we'd be in now. Now, if we look forward, and this might be impossible, but that's why I want to ask it. If we look forward in 10 years, what, hypothetically at least, what could our relationship to technology be like? What could our relationship to AI be like? What would our everyday, life look like?
Well, I think to answer that question, you'd have to kind of consider which way we're currently breaking, right? Are we on the good path or the superabundance path that Elon likes to talk about? Or are we on kind of like the doomer path, right? Where it's all going to end. And I don't think we definitively made any decisions right now that would kind of doom us to one or the other necessarily. So, I tend to think that there's still a really good opportunity here to ensure that we head on that golden path towards a very to a very brighter future. But I think that there's some very important decisions that will be made in the next year that I think will have a huge influence on which way we break. Part of that is, I think, how much time and energy we're putting into mechanic interpretability. We're trying to understand the black box of these models so we can make sure that they're effectively aligned, right? Because for the most part, we know it has set the conditions for them to emerge, grow them, right? Because that's essentially what's happening according to Anthropic. But we don't know how to steer them effectively, right? Aside from a very superficial level. And in the end of the day, whether they have been effectively steered or not is really just a question of observing their behavior, right? Because we can't observe their internal thought processes, we don't know for sure. So I think the ability to steer these models is going to have a significant impact on what life's going to be like in the future. So let's just say things break in a positive direction. We figure out how to keep these models aligned to us, and they end up serving human flourishing. I think it's very likely that we'll have kind of two economies that will emerge, right? There's the more conventional GDP economy, which is, building up technology and manufacturing, and I'm sure people like Elon will be trying to use that to get us to Mars. And then you'll have this kind of like we call like Etsy economy, right? Whereas it's people who now have time on their hands are choosing to use their gifts and abilities to kind of give that human touch back to goods and services. And this economy will emerge with people who want to pay more for those goods and services because they're human. So I think that there'll still be lots of work to be done in the future. So I think people will still be busy. I think it's likely that there'll be kind of a mass migration out of cities where people want to connect again with nature, and they probably want to move into kind of tighter communities and work on building kind of friendships and having more time, right, to spend with their kids outdoors. The things that we typically dream about as human beings and often have to sacrifice in order to pay our mortgages. So I think that trajectory is probably inevitable if the technology breaks in the right direction. If it doesn't break, in the right direction, there's a lot of science fiction movies which have kind of postulated how this would look. But I do think you'd have a kind of a massive welfare state, a lot of inequality. You'd have a lot of people addicted to VR and gaming and things like that. And I think you'd have a real high casualty rate, because I think a lot of people would be chasing dopamine hits, as I've said before, right off of a cliff. So in many ways, we may have conquered disease, and provided AI doesn't kill us, we may have conquered disease. We may have access to unlimited information, but I think that ultimately, because our formation is poor, because the church's evangelization has failed, people are lost.
And Father, I know that you're a professor. You work with students. These are oftentimes some of the youngest, brightest of these upcoming generations. When they come to you and they look for spiritual wisdom, for hope, for kind of that formation and looking into that next chapter when they start to have a career, when they start to form families, when you look 10 years down the line and you see maybe an 18-year-old who you're starting to teach, they're asking the right questions, they're curious, they have all that enthusiasm. What roadmap do you send them on? What does that look like when you start to prepare someone for a future that arguably we're speculating, we're thinking about, we're dreaming?
The students tell me that first of all, they're not afraid of AI, which is kind of interesting. And this is the generation that grew up with AI. Is growing up with AI, because I think like Matthew said, what we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be pretty spectacular compared to what we see today. They're not afraid of AI, and maybe because they haven't thought about the possibility of the human race being destroyed. The second thing which is important to them is to understand how to use it to their advantage. So let me put it this way. They're not so much afraid of the AI as they are of not using it in the right way. In other words, their competition is not against the AI, but against somebody who has dominated the AI and is competing for the same position, the same job, the same space in society. And so I thought that was fascinating. Geoffrey Hinton, who is the godfather of AI, they say, and he won the Nobel Prize in physics for machine learning. He's one of the pioneers of machine learning. Has a recent interview, and you can find it on YouTube. It's quite popular. The title is "These Jobs Will No Longer Be Around in 20 Months." You may have seen it. It's quite popular. And so things are really going to change. What I foresee is we're going to adapt, and we're going to be used to living with AIs. AIs as part of society that you're going to have to live with, and you're going to have to take into account, which today is not that common. We don't relate to an AI as if it were an entity. We kind of, especially if you're still using queries, typing them in, and instead of using your voice and looking at a video or an audio, which is much more humane. That's the way we deal with each other. And so I think the platforms are becoming more and more humane in that sense. They're becoming easier. The interfaces are becoming more and more human-like, and so that makes it easier to use. Once the human race understands the presence of AIs as part of our society, a lot's going to change. But I think we're just going to get used to it.
How comfortable would you be if the robots in the future look like us when we're walking around? Or
Not at all. And Stanford made a great psychological study, because they showcased some of the first robots, Stanford University. And at the beginning, there were basically two things. At the beginning, there was a sense of excitement and novelty, because they would send the robots out on campus, right? And people would turn, and they think that was great. As time went on, like 2 or 3 months in, they started destroying the robots, because the humans felt threatened. And so you have students with bats going out, baseball bats, going out and actually, ruining the robots. You have people that would cross the street to avoid being on the same. Yeah.
But these are like the unitary robots that they aren't. I mean, they are.
Well, they're like
humanoid.
R2-D2, yeah.
Right. But imagine they look like us. Do you still think?
I think it'll be even worse if you can tell that it's not human.
Right.
Yeah, it's going to be even scarier.
That's like the Westworld scenario is something that I think a lot about, right? I mean, at some point, are we going to have to say, if we're going to be living, our day-to-day lives with robots, and they're going to be walking by us in the street, they have to have there has to be some clear indication that this is a robot, right? I do kind of feel that may be something what we need to do just for the health of civilization, right? Because I think that the dynamics between people and robots could get very unhealthy. I mean, obviously we're already seeing crazy projection, right? Like think of character AI. that's something that worries me.
Matthew, if you can unpack that. So for a lot of people who aren't, focusing on this on a daily basis, the idea of robots, literally interacting with humans on a daily basis seems something, from science fiction. How likely is that? And how soon do you foresee, robots being on, maybe not on the streets of Rome, but definitely in the streets of, in Mountain View, in Silicon Valley, and some of these?
Well, they're already in the factories, right? I mean, we're already starting to see them deployed. Figure robots are on the BMW manufacturing floor, right? And Amazon's deploying them like crazy. So I think for some time, and to some extent, we've been interacting with robots. But, I think what's going to be wild is these robots, the form factors of the robots were very inhuman, right? They weren't very intelligent, and they were in very specific lanes. But now I think as the robots become more generally intelligent and more humanoid, they're going to be able to move in kind of the human environment, right? And so that's the thing that gets very odd, right? I mean, I think right now, I think manufacturing robots is very hard. Only a few companies can do it, and we're still at the very early stages of this. But if you're going to fast forward 10 years, right? At that point, we probably will have conquered the whole manufacturing complexity. We'll be shipping these things at scale. I mean, Elon Musk thinks it'll be like 6 billion robots. It's like or more. He thinks
he wants one in every.
Right, and I think he said at times that there could be like some X factor more than there are humans on Earth, right? So, and to some extent, I mean, I could see that being good, if they're performing all the tasks that humans would prefer not to do, and we have time for the things that we consider in life that really matter. But I do worry about, I think when we think about robots being manufactured at scale and being deployed in the world, we think about them just solving new world problems. But we sometimes we don't focus on how some people are going to project and anthropomorphize those robots, and because they haven't learned how to develop deep social connections, right, with others, that they may become attached to these things emotionally. And so I think it's quite possible some people, when they say, I love my robot and I'm going to marry my robot, and everyone else in society, you have to accept that this is now my spouse, and I expect it to be treated as such. When I get invited to a party, I expect my robot wife to be there, and my robot wife may look, humanoid, and I expect you to treat it like any other human. This is the kind of these kind of tensions, I think, are going to emerge, and I don't think we as a society are ready for this yet, but I think it's probably inevitable.
Well, that just scared me, what you just said. I hadn't really thought about that. But I was in San Francisco about a month ago, and Waymo has a bunch of self-driving taxis. And in fact, they're probably, I think, more now than the regular taxis. But I remember watching a person hail a taxi, and it was a person driving. And they passed, they said, no, keep going. And because they wanted a Waymo. And I thought, ooh, we're now preferring the self-driving car to the human driving car. And there are a series. I looked this up, and I think there's a couple of reasons. One, people tend to feel more relaxed without a human there. They don't have to say anything if they don't want to. They don't have to listen to anything if they don't want to. Etc. But with a human, it's unpredictable. You never know, especially if they don't speak English very well, which is very common in San Francisco. Better to learn Spanish. But I think they're also safer. I think if you look at the record, they have almost no crashes, or no one has ever died yet. Well, in a Tesla, one person did die about 4 years ago, but Elon handled that, I think, well. They made a mistake. Anyway, the self-driving cars are statistically much safer than human driving cars.
You don't have to tip a robot either, right? Presumably, right? I mean, I hear that complained a lot about tipping culture, how it's,
that's another advantage, true.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I think if people have the choice, I think in the very near term, between interacting with a smart AI, not a dumb AI we dealt with when we called telephone lines in the past, but a smart AI who can efficiently, do what we need to do agentically, or dealing with the human. That's just kind of crazy to me. Is I think most people are going to choose the AI, right? And if you think about that, that puts a lot of pressure on companies to adapt, right, to people's new preferences, and they will, right, because I think it saves them money, and they're responding, to what their customers want. And so, for those who are trying to keep people in the labor market, I think they have a real challenge.
Yeah, Ben, let me just give you one last example in terms of my experience, and I won't name names because the students will get mad at me, but I asked them at the beginning of the semester how many of them, and I probably should have waited so that they have confidence in me and whatnot, but how many of you have AI girlfriends or AI boyfriends? And they all kind of snickered. They all kind of chuckled, you know, and nobody raised their hand. Later, in office hours, I found that when they were alone with me, they said, I spend roughly 2 to 3 hours a day chatting with an AI, usually at nighttime. And they think at the beginning, they think it's a cure for loneliness. But as time goes on, they realize it's not. And Harvard just came out with a study about, Ron Ivey is actually doing a lot of work on this. Like you mentioned, character AI, there are a lot of other platforms that are catering to emotional attachments, and Harvard is finding empirical evidence that it does not cure loneliness. You would think it would, because you're interacting with the AI and it's responding. If you ever saw the movie Her, yeah, that's that. But in reality, people understand that it's a one-way relationship. On the other side, there's not a real human being.
And so, Father, if we play that forward and we keep it, this exercise of looking 10 years down the line, if we try to map that out, and as Matthew mentioned, we have this fork, and things can go very well, and that's what we hope for, and that's what we're working towards. But things can also start to go in the wrong direction. What do you think needs to happen now, as we're kind of in that that genesis point where these companies are starting to develop these character AI, and it's something that's still relatively new. But if you have enormous percentages of the population, and it's growing, and they're lonely, and they're using these AI, chatbots to talk to confront their loneliness, to try to build relationships, but it's obviously not solving that. What needs to change now? What can we do, and what can the church do to address this issue?
I think one of the most important things is to realize how our purpose in life is tied to our jobs. Matthew and I have spoken a lot about this. In the future, that can't be the case, because a lot of people aren't going to have a job. They're not going to have a regular 9 to 5, which is just simply part of reality, and it has been for, since Adam and Eve.
Father, if I can say something just on that, I think, and I totally agree with this, but I think that's a very hard reality that I don't really think people at all, honestly, are confronting, because it's too existentially frightening. The idea that enormous percentage of the population will not have a job.
Oh, you asked me what's going to happen in 10 years, and that's one of, if you talk to anybody, I just had a conversation yesterday with the head of AI for Salesforce, which is a large company. And that was the first thing. He says, Father, what is the purpose of life? And I'm like, John, I thought, John Defoe is his name. I said, John, I thought we were going to talk about AI. He says, oh yeah, we're talking about AI. Because if your purpose in life is attached integrally to your job, and you lose your job, we already see it with people who are unemployed. It's very, very challenging. It's very difficult
Denise
for them.
Hassabis basically say something like that to you as well when you talk to him? He asked you some kind of...
Oh, well, no, he asked me what was the goal of the universe.
That's pretty cool that they're asking.
Right, it's the philosophical question that's been asked since Plato. Why is there something instead of nothing? What is it all about? And I know it sounds like a cliche now, but these are going to become extremely important and everyday questions. And I completely agree with Matthew and yourself. People are just not ready for that.
Well, and it's a loaded question, though, right? Because it depends what you mean by work, right? How you define it. I mean,
a job.
Yeah, I think
an institutional job.
Yeah, I think if we continue to think about like work or a job, and like in a traditional 9 to 5, like I work and I contribute to GDP. That's essentially what I do, right? And I do that so I can...
And you get paid.
And I get paid. So I can pay my mortgage, right? So I can put my kids through college. And that's kind of like the paradigm. Then, yeah, it's highly probable. I know some people say 30%, 50%. I think it's going to be more like 80%, 90% of those jobs are just going to be gone, right? And the people that are in that job market are going to be people that can uniquely like hybridize with these AI systems and work, So we're talking like the top 1%. In each respective field, be working with AIs, and everybody else, they won't be able to add value, and so they'll have time in their hands. But I think there is a really important distinction to be made between working so I can make money so I can, pay my mortgage and make sure my kids get through college and make sure my kids can eat. And, which is really, kind of essential. I mean, which I may do simply because I have to do it in order to provide for the Maslow needs. And like this feeling that what I'm doing is what God meant for me to do, right? Like I've discerned that I have these gifts and I'm now using these gifts to glorify God and serve others, right? And have that confidence. And I think for people that find themselves, who are fortunate to find themselves in roles where they are using those gifts and they have that conviction, I don't think the pay really matters. I mean, obviously they want to take care of their people's Maslow's needs, but let's say in the future, if the powers that be know that in order to ensure that the pitchforks are all over the streets and coming after all the heads of the AI labs, that they have to find some way to make sure that that their Maslow needs are taken care of, right? So shelter, food, security, knowing that their kids, have the opportunity to grow and develop and improve themselves. If those are kind of guaranteed in some way, I'm not going to go into details as to how that could happen, but let's say that's happened. And that people have the opportunity to then discern what are my gifts and how can I put them at the service of others. I think there'll be all kinds of problems and opportunities to work, right? I just think it just won't be in a way that we're accustomed to. And I think that adjustment will be very, really hard, but I think it is a necessary one. And frankly, it's probably a healthy one. And it's been a long time coming.
And Matthew, do you think that adjustment will happen in the upcoming 10 years, or is that going to be a prolonged transition that, will provide unique challenges and will take, let's say a generation, or, we're looking more than 10 years?
I mean, in a perfect world, it'd probably be nice if we had the time, to do it a little bit more slowly, but I just don't think it's going to work out that way. I mean, I think AI is going to completely eat white collar work as we know it for the most part. And I think that blue collar, work, I think will be one of the last to fall. Factory jobs are more immediately at risk, but there's a lot of like blue collar jobs, like, electricians and plumbing. I mean, where you have to walk into a house and you have to operate in these very complex environments and every house is unique. And these are very difficult spaces for robots to operate in. So I think those jobs will be secure, but still, even if those jobs are secure for the next, let's say like 7 years or whatever, eventually robots are going to come for those jobs too. So I really don't think that many jobs are going to be safe. I think that and again, I'm talking about the GDP economy. It's not to say that I don't think that when people, let's say, move out of the cities and they form new communities, they may simply choose to have people perform, certain duties. They could be done by robots, but they just choose not to because it's just, in some ways, they feel it's good for them. It's good for the community, right? So I think that a lot of communities will be forced to do that, but I don't think we have a lot of time here. By the end of the Trump administration, manufacturing of robots is going to really start scaling up because AI and robots you'll start seeing really generalized robots, which are capable of really performing almost any task a human can do. And I think once the public becomes aware that we're at the precipice of robots automating away blue-collar jobs, I think there'll be a pretty intense reaction. And so I think we're going to have to find a way to demonstrate for people that the transition that they're making, letting go of those jobs, is actually going to be better for them in the long run, because we've thought a lot about what the world could look like if you make this choice with us, and don't worry, here's all the things that you worry about now you won't have to worry about in the future. But right now, when we look at, the current paradigm, and you ask the average person, do you think that the Trump administration is ready for this, right? And they have a game plan for how? I don't think so. And that's what makes me nervous, because I think they're going to need years to prepare for this. And I don't see a lot of focus on that particular.
Yeah, Ben, you mentioned a generation. Remember that in this field, 10 years is a generation. I would even say 5 years is a generation, and some probably would say 6 months. It depends on who you speak with, but it's not a generation. A generation is what, 40 years usually, when up until now. But the accelerated pace of change is going to just be devastating. And again, I think it would be very difficult. For example, you have all kinds of different groups. You have Alcoholics Anonymous, for example. You have groups, Bible study. You have human beings tend to come up with these kinds of organizations or group setting to help each other, to exchange ideas, to think about stuff. Nobody is thinking about this kind of future. But when when push comes to shove and you lose your job, I think there's going to be a natural tendency to start forming these kinds of groups. Okay, now what do we do that we don't have a job anymore?
Yeah, and if those groups aren't going to be just like rage sessions, right, where people are basically they don't feel they have
not
hope.
Constructive.
Exactly, and I think that I would totally understand if somebody has lost their job and now they're wondering how they're going to feed their kids. I would be outraged at that, but I think that's why it's so important that the people in charge, I think, in a very practical way, have to share a practical vision, right, for where we're kind of headed, and to assure people that, no, man, be hopeful because things are going to get better and you're going to be okay. And I think that's more than just a line. Like, they have to come up with a tangible plan that they can sell us on, meaning they have to paint a very clear picture of what my life's going to be like in the future. And that has to be a future that I can't wait for my kid to grow up in, because it's definitely going to be better, because they're going to be able to grow and realize their potential in ways that they can't in the current paradigm. And that's not going to be an easy sell. And frankly, I don't think the secular governments on their own are going to effectively do this. Like, I think there's a very profound role for the Pope in this, because I think a lot of envisioning that future comes down to thinking about what is civilization about, right? What are the things that will truly make me feel fulfilled? What are the things that will ensure my flourishing, right? And I think to get clear on what those things are, you need people like the Pope and other kind of spiritual leaders to help us color that, and then effectively, then you can go take that to government and say, well, here's what we think flourishing consists of. Now come up with a plan on how to execute that, right? And then once that vision becomes clear, we can start working backwards and say, how do we ensure that the AI and robots we're developing are pointed at the right problems, right? Because we have finite robots and finite compute. So the question is, well, where do we want to direct those resources, right? Some will say direct them to Mars, because and I think that that's not a bad thing, but I do think focusing on planet Earth and ensuring that people here are going to prosper probably should be our number one priority.
I mean, it sounds obvious, but and I try to convince tech leaders in Silicon Valley that they are also co-responsible for this, and they don't want to hear it. They're like, oh, we just offer a product. We offer, like you mentioned before, we offer a tool that you can use or you cannot use. But when we get to a point where AI is pervasive and robots are part of our society like other people, then the changes are going to come rapidly. And I do believe that some of the brighter people in Silicon Valley realize this and are willing to take their share of responsibility. It's not. They're not just pushing a product. They're changing the future. They're literally changing the future. And so my hope is, again, they probably don't have the answer. I don't think any one person has the answer. But at least we're starting to think about the ramifications of this.
The thing is, too, it's not fair, like, to the heads of the AI lab. I mean, the people that are building the technology, we shouldn't be expecting the engineers to also be figuring out what civilization's about and solving for that, right? I mean, I think that's even on the question of alignment. Like, they're supposed to be aligning their models in principle to like a value set, right? I mean, it's not fair for the engineers to have to figure that one out, right? And we,
I don't know. I disagree. I think Google and Meta and Microsoft should have courses for their engineers on philosophy and theology. I know that sounds strange.
No. That makes sense to me. But then it still comes down to the question of, to train their model, right? They have to come up with values, right? They have to come up with like an eval set, right? In order to ensure the model's effectively aligned. They have to train it and then ensure it's aligned properly. Exactly, and that's something that does concern me. Like, I do think, like, people like Demis Haspers from DeepMind and Dario Modi from Anthropic. I mean, they got kids, as far as I know, and they care about the future. And when they talk about this technology, they take every opportunity to reflect. They are concerned about how disruptive this technology is, and they really do hope that there's regulation to ensure that the technology is developed safely and it's pointed at the right problems. And I think for the most part, they have a pretty good sense of what those problems are for the most part. But again, we have to step up. Like, I think it's important that civil society, that we the people, are become better educated about where these technologies are at now and where they're likely to lead, so that we can basically engage in a more public conversation, with our elected leaders, but also with each other, about what our vision for the technology is and what ways we want to see it developed and what ways we don't. And then essentially that conversation should inform what regulation emerges. And I think that I think the AI labs would respond very favorably to that. But I think right now, what we're all just like, I feel like we're all sitting back and we're watching, we're just amazed at how this technology is developing, and we're not actually thinking it through, right?
But look at someone like Fei Li at Stanford University. She founded the Center of Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, and in a brief, a small amount of words, it says a lot. If your AI center is focused on the benefiting human beings, or what we would say human flourishing, then that I think that's the right direction. Human-centered AI. That's the name of the center that she runs, and I'll leave that out. We'll come back to that if you're interested.
Oh, it's a wonderful name for a center. And then Father Philip and Matthew. Rumor has it that Pope Leo XIV is working on his encyclical. And they've mentioned that it's most likely going to be touching on the subject of artificial intelligence. Now, the church has witnessed technological transformations. It's seen societal transformations, the good and the bad. What would be an optimal response from Pope Leo XIV and the church in tackling AI? What would that look like? The church has gotten a lot of criticism, in the last century of being late to the game or reacting or not being effective. Pope Leo seems energized. He seems, very committed. He seems like, he wants to focus on the right issues. What, Father Philip and Matthew, what suggestions or recommendations would you give if given the opportunity, and what would you like to see happen?
Well, I think you need to ask Pope Leo. He's already pronounced at least 5 important speeches or discourses on AI. And if you want, we could go through that. I pretty much have memorized most of them because it's vintage Pope Leo. I'm sure he has people advising and that help him and whatnot, but you can tell in the discourses that it's him. He's writing this stuff.
And Father, maybe walk us through, briefly on what has he underlined?
The dignity of the human person, the difference between artificial intelligence and human intelligence, respect for the workforce. He doesn't want massive layoffs, etc. What's the other? He has a great phrase on June 21st. He spoke to a group of interparliamentary members in the Vatican, and he said, human beings need other human beings for authentic relationships and not a soulless machine. And I underline that phrase, soulless machine, LESS, because machines don't have souls. And I thought it's wonderful that somebody is finally saying these kinds of things. I'm not against the technology. I'm not against robots, but they're not the same as us. And for human beings to interact, it's the soul mediated by the body and all kinds of, that anthropology gives us a whole structure of the human being. So the soul doesn't relate to another soul immediately, like Plato used to say that the eyes were the window to the soul, right? Which is more of a metaphor than anything else, because Plato knew that the soul was mediated also by all kinds of things, not just the body, but memory, emotions, and the list goes on. But the machine is not. It doesn't have a soul at the end. And I think that's a wonderful phrase. So I'm excited. I've already done several interviews. So has Matthew. A couple of those are coming out in the near future. but anyway, it's all about. And I told them, let's just wait to see what Leo said. Instead of, trying to guess, we already know he's already spoken very clearly about the issue, so we know where he's going to go. And the final word I wanted to say is Pope Leo is not going to write a Rerum Novarum 2. He's going to, because that would just be a repetition of something you don't need to repeat. The principles are the same, the social doctrine of the church, et cetera, et cetera. But he's going to write something new. And he's going, as he said, he's going to do for our time what Pope Leo XIII did for his time. So I'm excited. I think it's going to be something novel. It's going to be something very rich. We already have the document from the Vatican on the 28th of January from the Dicastery of Education and Culture and from the Doctrine of the Faith. And so that, I think, is a good guideline. That's a very good synthesis of the Catholic view of artificial intelligence. But I have a feeling he's going to come up with some new stuff, which is going to be powerful.
The Pope is smarter than me, and he's advised by people who are smarter than me. So yeah, I wouldn't want to presume. But because I'm not as smart, I'm more inclined to make mistakes like I'm going to make now, and I'm just kind of postulate a little bit. I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to jump in because I have no doubt that the Pope is going to clarify the important role of human beings and the important role of work and the importance of ensuring that when we develop technologies that they're directed towards human flourishing. I have no doubt. I'm not really sure how much he's going to delve into how we should go about developing this technology and how it should be effectively developed and deployed right in the world. That'll be really interesting to see. But one thing I hope this Pope will focus on, I'm sure that there are advisors who are telling him, we got to slow this thing down. We got to slow the AI down. We got to slow it down so we can figure out how this thing works so that we can make sure we can effectively align it, like I said earlier. And I'm deeply sympathetic to that. I think that that's a very worthy goal. And I wish that was something that practically will actually play out. I doubt it will. And I doubt that the Pope's lobbying for us to slow down will have much of effect at all. I still think that the church needs to be on the record, right, on this. And I think he does need to kind of, say what he thinks the guardrail should be. Like, what are some healthy ways that AI and robots should be deployed in the world that would be obvious, right? And what are some ways they should not be deployed in the world because they would obviously impede human flourishing, right? I mean, obviously, like, if I marry my robot, he'd be like, that's no good, right? That's not a good thing, right? I mean, if all your friends are robots, this is not a good thing. So there's a lot of obvious things that he could clarify. Obvious to us Catholics, maybe not so obvious to a lot of other people, like especially the transhumanists who are driving a lot of this technology. So I think being on the record there is important. But I think the one thing I would say to him, that the one area that the heads of the AI labs don't feel qualified to speak to, and it feels, and I think many of the politicians just don't get around to it, right? Because they're distracted by a lot of media concerns, is what is the point of life, right? What is the point of the human being? Right? What is the point of civilization? Those are the things I think we need to hear right now, because we're talking about like empowering all these AI and robots to basically build a brand new future, right? Which is supposed to be better, but better how, right? And I think we need to have a much more detailed conversation about how these technologies are going to make life better. And I think that starts with understanding what the human being's about, right? And what civilization is about. If what life's about, and as a Catholic, I'll just share this as a Catholic perspective, is figuring out who I am, what do I have to offer the world, and ensuring that I fulfill my purpose here on earth to serve others and glorify God, right? Obviously, that's a distillation. But if that's what life's about, how much are these AI and robots being directed towards helping me figure that out, right? And if our civilization is meant to basically help facilitate human flourishing, so basically helping people with that process, how much time and attention are we focusing on ensuring that the technologies we're developing are going to directly service that mission? There's a lot of like time and attention focused on like curing disease and things like that, which is great, and that makes a lot of sense, right? And I think there's a big commercial upside to doing that. But what I worry about is like the existential part, the stuff that ultimately matters more, because when people don't have things to do, they will end up chasing dopamine hits right off of a cliff, and so they need to feel like they matter, and they need to have some sense of what life's about. They have some sense of purpose, and I think if we don't get clearer about that, we could be in a lot of trouble. And so I hope he focuses, a chunk of his pontificate helping us to remember that.
Yeah, the governor of the state of Massachusetts came out the other day and said she is promoting a law that students between kindergarten and 8th grade cannot take their phones to school. Now, when I first heard this, and apparently this is being debated in the state legislature, and it's got a lot of support, like from all the superintendents of the schools, because they're saying the kids aren't learning, they're playing with their cell phones. But I'm simplifying that it's not that easy. They have to be careful. You can't take a cell phone away from a person who is challenged or disabled in one way, or a person that has a problem with speech or an impediment or a different language. So, but they're smart people. They're taking into account all these things. It's not just going to be a ban. That's the way it looks. They're banning cell phones because that's the easy way to say it. But I think they're going to do it in an intelligent way. 10 years ago, that would have been completely unheard of, that a state would actually prohibit students from taking their phones to school. I don't allow my students to have phones in my class. And I got permission from my dean, and he says, oh yeah, this is becoming very common. And so the first day of class at last semester, I realized that the students didn't bring their phones. And I said, what, did you guys already hear this? Oh yeah, word gets around. This is I mean, college is like that. It's word of mouth. And they were thankful for that. They're like, we're here to learn. We're not here to play with our phones. And not that's the only thing they do with their phones. It can actually be very, very useful. But the other thing is that I wanted to mention is there is a series of commercials now in Boston, which were quite surprising. And it's about the psychological effects on youth of too much screen time. They're calling it screen time. And the first words of one of the commercials, which I really like, is that teenagers have exchanged FaceTime for FaceTime. You know?
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah, you understand immediately what the difference is. I'm not against the iPhone. I have one, but it's very telling. And then, of course, they have all kinds of statistics about teenage depression, teenage suicide rates, which have gone sky high, and other issues because of I don't want to say unsupervised screen time, but let's just say non-intelligent use of this technology.
And Father, to that point, there was a recent study that came out, I believe it was from MIT, talking about also the brain and neurological development for people who use ChatGPT.
It came out, I'm sorry, but I was asked about this. So it was unpublished for a while, and they finally got it published. It's a very sophisticated study. It's about 200 pages long, and I suggest you to have a read of it. It's very carefully done, and it's excellent. But it got a lot of airtime.
This is the one that said, essentially, that people that use ChatGPT are dumber.
Yep. Yeah, and they prove it. I mean, they have the evidence to. Well, dumber is not a very nice word. But they say the more you use AI, the less capacity for critical thinking you have.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, I want to be clear. Like, I think when I said dumber, I don't actually mean the capacity's not there. It's just basically like any muscle. You don't use your brain, right?
Yeah. No, you're not mistaken. But I don't think the study would say it that way. But essentially, that's the right point.
And Father, just to piggyback on that, so different educational institutions for young people, for young adults, for children, there seem to be taking action to really kind of correct an overuse of the screen, whether it be for social media or in this case with the MIT study talking about critical thinking, and if you offload your actual thinking, you're gonna not have the same ability to be aware or critically think in that sense. Do you think, as Matthew's talking about, okay, if AI goes really well, and if this future allows for the majority of people to have a lot more free time or to be able to focus on on those virtuous activities and to really form themselves, do you think as we get closer to that, people are going to be intentionally reducing the amount of that type of technological input, whether it be parents, whether it be schools, whether it be for research?
Yes, I think it's human nature. It's human nature. At the beginning of the use of a certain technology, there's kind of like this fascination. There's, we're in love with the technology. And little by little, as time goes on, we start using it for our true benefit, for achieving the goals that we have placed. That's why Matthew says the most important thing is to know what your goal is. Because what do you say? You have to know where you're going, otherwise you're not going to get there.
Cardinal Collins used to always say to me, if you know where you're going, you're more likely to get there.
Right. And so the people play with things at the beginning, but then they realize, is this helping me achieve my goal? And again, it's not that they're sitting down and talking to a priest or a psychologist or a parent. They come to the awareness on their own. Is this helping me achieve my goals or not? And if it's not, then I'm going to change. Now, it's easy for me to say that, but and that awareness may happen over years of experience. For example, I taught a graduate course last semester. And the graduate students are much different than the undergraduate students. And so one of the first things I said is never hand me a paper that you did through ChatGPT. And they all kind of snickered. And I'm like, because these are all, seniors and up, post seniors. And they said, "Oh yeah, Father, when I was a freshman, I did a lot of, my assignments through ChatGPT, but I realized I wasn't learning anything." And I'm like, that just warms my heart. I didn't have to tell them. They came to that awareness that I was wasting my time. And where I teach is not cheap. And so I'm wasting my parents' money as well. And so I never had a problem with AI. If you want, I can even give you an example of how we used it in class, which was extremely powerful, extremely useful. And I tell the other people who will listen, I'm on the steering committee of AI at the university. My motto is, let's come up with an intelligent way to use artificial intelligence. The worst thing you can do is use it for something that it wasn't meant to be used for. But I think in the long run, we're going to use it intelligently. And I think that's Matthew's point also. That's why he came up with Magisterium AI. That's a very intelligent use of AI. And that's why I think it's so popular.
I don't want to be overly cynical. I mean, but I do think for those, there's a problem of formation, I think, that's out there, right? I mean, so I think for those of us who've been, gifted to be Catholics and been raised in the faith and benefited from decent Catholic theological, philosophical, and spiritual formation, I think that, it's easy. We have even been distracted at times, no doubt, right, by technology. And we've had to say, I've gone too far. I got to get back what I'm supposed to be doing, right? But I think, it's easier for us because we can always go back and look at ourselves, right? I mean, even for us who spend time in the confessional, and we kind of get that reorienting, right? For a lot of people, though, who don't have the benefit of that formation, I do worry. Because although I do feel that if somebody is raised, in a healthy community in which they have healthy relationships modeled, and I think that naturally they're going to be disposed towards that, and they're going to understand why there's more value than a cheap substitute. But I think there's a lot of people out there who've never had those relationships modeled effectively, right? They're from broken homes. I mean, certainly the media they've been consuming shows all kinds of relationships and that aren't ideal, right?
That's a nice way of saying it.
Right. So they don't really have a clear sense for what the Catholic life, like fully lived out, the benefits of it. So what do they do? Then they choose the good that is proximate to them that they think, is what makes them feel good, right? I mean, it feels satisfying and fulfilling. And I think that's why, like gaming, if I have time in my hands, I don't know what my gifts are, so I don't know how to use them, and I don't know what to do with my time. And I don't know how I can make a contribution. And then my buddies say, "Hey, want to jump on? Why don't we go play Halo or something?" Right? Why not? Right? And you could see how that's fun. In some ways you are connecting with other human beings. And
they have massive communities, don't they?
Exactly. They do. I mean,
hundreds of people.
In fairness, I consider myself like a gamer. I love gaming, right? But when you're playing it, you can see the draw. I put time in, and my character gets better, right? He levels up, and my skills of the game evidently, like, they get better, right? So I put time in, and I flourish, at least in that paradigm. Now, but ultimately we know that's not going to be satisfying, right? And you can spend all kinds of time distracting yourself in there endlessly, right? I mean, waking up, playing gaming, going to sleep, but eventually you're gonna tap out, right? You're gonna reach the epitome of the gaming world and realize that it's not satisfying. You're really looking for something else, and whether it be pornography or whatever else. I just think that there'll be there'll be many distractions which will promise to be fulfilling, and ultimately they're not going to be fulfilling. And then this is what we call the existential cliff. And at some point, those do not satisfy. You can't find like a source of distraction or entertainment, or or a dopamine hit that makes you feel like you want to keep going, wake up again, hit it again. And this is where we worry about people going off the cliff, right? Because they just don't know what else is out there. And I worry that if the church is not effective in its evangelization mission, we don't leverage these tools to meet people where they're at, to connect with them, That when they turn around at that edge, maybe to take one more look back to see if there's anything else. If they don't see it, like the hand of the church outstretched, inviting them to try one more thing, they're just going to jump, and we're going to lose a lot of people. And I'm starting to get this, I'm getting more and more stronger conviction that we're not doing enough, and that there's a lot of people who will be lost because I just didn't commit enough time and energy to ensuring that the gospel was reaching them. And I think this is something that all of us should be concerned about. We should all be concerned about this.
And Matthew, when did you kind of come to this realization that this existential cliff is in front of us? When that you saw that AI and the technosphere was going to lead this? Because the way you've mapped it out, it seems, in my eyes, very obvious that is where we're headed. And I can see a lot of young, particularly young men, who can't get a job. There is no way for them to contribute in any meaningful way, and they're completely isolated. And they have the AI girlfriend or whatever. I could see them saying, "What's the point?"
Well, I guess you could say I got a kind of a glimpse of it when I was in college, when all of a sudden I realized that everyone in my dorm, instead of studying, was playing Diablo, and they were and they were looking at porn. And that was basically what they were spending their time doing, right? And it was kind of shocking for me. At the time I was an evangelical Christian, and this was just shocking to me. And I even got pulled into that game. It was Diablo 2 was the game we were playing. Right? Diablo of all games.
In my days, it was Doom.
Yeah.
We're both dating ourselves.
We're dating ourselves. I mean, and I even played the game, and it was a lot of fun. I mean, it was fun because, like I said, you invest time, you level the character up, and you're doing it with other people, right? So it feels kind of social. But again, that was kind of a microcosm. Eventually, you wake up to reality and realize you got to pass your exams and finish the papers, and you graduate, and you get pulled into the machine, right? But then there was another moment when we were working on human flourishing together at the Humanity 2.0 Foundation. So there was a number of studies that were coming our way, and one was talking about birth rates and marriage rates and all these other really important statistics, which really kind of like signal kind of the health and vitality of a society. In some parts of the world, they were just tanking, right? I mean, China's an easy one because of their one-child policy and everything else, but Japan was another one, right? Where and this is more immediate, where they're having, as far as I know, they're having to actually invest time and energy into programs teaching young people how to court, because they just don't know how to do that. Imagine that. So like they don't know the court. So I mean, imagine what that means for marriage and family and having children and things like that. And so I started realizing like this is existentially a real problem, right? If people are too self-conscious and don't feel equipped or feel like they have enough value to become one with another person, right? To join our lives together, and so they just abandon that whole enterprise. Like we're heading for the abyss pretty quick, and I think that probably is like a canary in a coal mine. Like I think a lot of the things that they were dealing with in Japan are becoming more and more a reality elsewhere, and if we don't nip that in the bud, we're going to be in big trouble. And Elon uses his platform all the time to talk about this, right? But I think ultimately, Elon is very good at pointing at the problem. I think what we don't hear enough of is what the actual solution is. And personally, Father Philip, I know would agree, the toolkit to solve this problem is the Catholic faith, right? And so again, we need to make sure that we're effective in evangelization, and we have to internalize and make this problem personal, right? Because it's going to touch people that we know.
I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think what Matthew has done is something similar to what I've done, and that is analyze behavior patterns. What are the tendencies that you see? How are people behaving in front of the technology, et cetera? And then you extrapolate. And we have to be a little bit careful because it's easy to extrapolate, but there are many, many different factors that come into play. But I think that Matthew has come to this conclusion because he's understood the behavior patterns. Psychologists do this all the time. That's why they're pretty good about predicting things. And that is why good economists always have a friend who's a psychologist, because economy is the study of economies is not a pure science. It's not like physics or chemistry or something. It's messy. It has human beings involved, and Milton Friedman was famous for this. Sometimes you make predictions which are completely absurd, and they never come about. Why? Because you didn't take into account all kinds of other factors that happen when people are buying things. One of the best studies I've found is that oftentimes people will be offered a choice of a product which costs $20 and the same exact, in every way, the same exact product costs $5. What do you think people buy, or what is the preference of people? Yeah, which you would think is absurd. And people go to great extent. They say, no, it's exactly the same. Oh, no, the stitching is different, or it doesn't have the label. Or so. No. These are identical products, and they will choose the one more expensive. Now, from a common sense point of view, that makes no sense. If you're going to get the same product, why don't you save $15? But in reality, that's the way they do it. So I think the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economy was one of the founders of this kind of psychological school because that's what economists do all the time. They predict trends, and they're trying to understand how things work. Human nature is a fascinating thing, and I agree with Matthew. I think he kind of looks at behavior and patterns, especially, and then extrapolates, because we're talking about 5 to 10 years. This is what's going to happen. Now, he may not be 100% correct. He may have not taken into account, some factors.
Nor can I take it for credit for it, because I just watch a lot of YouTube videos like everybody else, right? I mean, I listen to the smartest people in the world who seem well informed, and every once in a while they're convincing.
Well, when they told Geoffrey Hinton, and of course he's a household name now, that he had won the Nobel Prize, apparently someone in the room was there. Because he didn't expect that. He said, "Oh, did you know that you won the Nobel Prize?" He said, "Oh, I didn't hear." Then he got a phone call, inviting him to Sweden to pick up the Nobel Prize for physics, if I'm not mistaken, and machine learning, with one of his colleagues. It was reported that he said, "Oh, okay." Good, because I'm getting my things in order now. And so that was kind of cryptic. What does that mean? And Jeffrey said, he says, "Oh, I'd be happy to explain what I meant by that. I'm looking at my different accounts, and I'm closing some that I don't need. I'm looking at my investments, and instead of long term, I'm going short term. I'm looking at things like my son's mortgage. I'm trying to get that paid off." And people started, and this is Geoffrey Hinton. He's not just some, teenager in Iowa who spouts stuff off. I'm getting my affairs in order. And he said, because we don't have much time. Now, we hope he's wrong. But Elon has also warned us. Bill Gates has warned us. Stephen Hawking has warned us. Eliezer Yudkowsky has warned us. A lot of people who are pioneers in the field are looking at the same traits and tendencies that Matthew's looking at, and what the godfather of AI he's called. I'm getting my things in order.
Well, but see, that's one thing that concerns me is, I think pointing out the fact that the future is going to be rough, and basically signaling that we have very low confidence that our elected leaders and our fellow citizens are going to manage this transition well, right? And it's going to get ugly. So I better liquidate everything, right? And make sure I got my bunker built. I mean, this has been
That's kind of the insinuation.
Yeah, I mean, and we've been seeing this kind of trend amongst...
Now, to be honest, he never said all these things, but he did say, "I'm getting my things in order." That was the quote.
Yeah.
And again, it was someone in the room, so obviously he didn't... he's not going on record.
But I think it's fair. It's fair to extrapolate, though. I mean, we've been seeing. There's been stories about certain the ultra rich building bunkers, right, and buying yachts just in case things go south. And so, in some ways, I'm like, well, if they're being pragmatic, right, and they're going to look after themselves and their families first. And so, in some ways, I don't begrudge them. But at the same time, it is a little bit concerning that the people that have achieved the highest levels of success, at least success metrics that are typically acknowledged, wealth and power and influence, are basically giving up. So if these are the smartest amongst us, and they're saying, "Nah, it's not going to happen," right? I mean, that's going to really take a pretty deep strike at hope, right? I mean, how are our politicians supposed to deliver us from this if the smartest people amongst us think it's not possible, right? I mean, are we going to believe our politicians more than we do these people? And so you can understand why there'd be some cynicism around this. And this is why I think it's so important that we find a way to chart the hopeful path And I don't think this is optimism. I mean, we still are agents in this world, and we can still change the future. We haven't made the decisions that have committed us to one path or the other. But I think if people don't have hope, and we don't know, again, to go back to Cardinal Collins, if we don't know where we're going, we're not going to get there, right? So it is important. Like I think it's important for we Catholics to talk about this issue, and we look to our Holy Father, and we look to the teachings of the gospel and the saints, and try and figure this out. And I think in many ways, what we're going to find out is that the problems that we're dealing with are not new; that they're probably old ones, right? That every civilization's probably struggled with, but we just have to kind of get back to first principles, as far as our faith goes, and just make sure that we're reorienting ourselves around those first principles, and ensure that the civilizations that we're influencing around us are heading in that same direction.
I think there is a brilliant thinker who is actually taking up the issue, as you mentioned. That's Yuval Harari. I hope I can mention. He has a new book I'm reading called Nexus, but the book that influenced me the most is called Homo Deus, where the final chapter is called Dataism, where he warns us about the future of technology. Now, if you're familiar with his writing, he's very, very famous. He is an historian in Israel.
I'm actually surprised that you brought him up, because he is controversial. That's interesting.
I don't agree, and I teach his chapter in my course on technology. I don't agree, but I don't. If you only teach stuff that you agree with, you're very going to be very limited. So I remember telling my students, I say, I recommend Harari's books because I think he's a deep thinker, and I say, oh yes, but he's very controversial, and he said, and I'm like, okay, I didn't say I agree with everything he says. But one of the things, and I think to Matthew's point, I remember asking some people in Silicon Valley, because he did a tour of Homo Deus a couple of years ago at Silicon Valley, and he's very popular with all the tech people. And I said, what's he doing in the book? Because he seems to be exalting the technology. He says, no, Father, you haven't understood what he's doing. What he's doing is warning us. He's saying, because he doesn't agree with a techno society either. He's very, very critical of that. And so he's trying to jolt us. He's trying to shock us. So the way he presents one of his famous phrases, if you are looking for a mate, Google is a lot better than a date. Things like, because he says the algorithm is going to get the better match for you than you just going on a date. Now,
well, it's going to edify your every impulse, right?
But I mean, those are the kind of things, and he disagrees with that. He disagrees with that, but he writes in a way that you would think, wait a second, are you suggesting that that's what we do? He said algorithms are going to beat humans. No, but he's saying you got to wake up, because this is the society that we're creating.
And I don't think we're alone in this. I mean, I think there's a lot of people out there who aren't Catholic, right, who would agree that the kind of the transhumanist vision of the future is not the one that we want to see play out here, right? And I'm talking about like
but it is going to be the one unless we take action.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like there's a video game that came out called Cyberpunk 2077, right? And I was quite fascinated with this game. I just thought it was a great technical achievement. But all the future that it depicts, where basically man and machine have merged, right? And they're kind of stuck in this loop where they're constantly trying to upgrade themselves and get to greater and greater capability, right? And I think there's a real risk of that, right? Especially in a society focused purely on utility, right? Your value is based upon what you contribute to the GDP economy, right? Or how much you contribute to a mission like getting to Mars. And so if that's like that's what your value is, then why wouldn't I, insert some like Neuralink into my brain, expand my computational capability, right? So I can compete with AIs and machines. And I feel like there'll be a lot of pressure from people to do that. And I think that is a big threat, because I think the minute we start heading down in this direction that man and machine need to merge, like that's our destiny, I think we're going to run off the rails real quick. And I think that's almost a line, right? And that is an area that I hope that the church will weigh into directly, right? And we, a while ago, I had a conversation with Father Alejandro Crosswaith, who's a professor at the Angelicum. And he made a really good point. It's not his point, it's from the church, but he made it very eloquently, recounted it for us. And he said, because the question of it was like, how far should this technology go? How far should like robotics go? I mean, is cyborgs inevitable, or is it something that we have to prevent at all costs? And so the question was like, all right, so what is the line? And he was asked this by a very prominent, transhumanist in the interview. And what he said kind of surprised me because it was so simple. He said, the technology that helps restore your full humanity, right? Or contributes to you fully living out your humanity is okay, right? But if the technology is in some ways hindering your humanity in some way or diminishing your humanity in some way, that's not okay. So the example he gave was like if you lost a limb in a car accident,
Sure,
right? And they gave you a robot arm so you could have your arm back, that's okay. But if you're replacing half your brain with a machine to expand your computational capabilities, that's not okay because that's detracting, it's diminishing your humanity. It may allow you on some metric to exceed in a certain way, but it comes at the cost of your humanity. And I thought that was a really interesting thought experiment.
Well, Matthew, I've been asked about this. People are going to surgically remove their legs to have prosthetic limbs, which are bionic.
Well, that's what Cyberpunk 2077 was like. Is basically people are doing it for all kinds of reasons, right? For capability, some because they think it looks good. Like and like when you're walking around this video game and you see this, right? And you can go into these, they call them ripper docs, where you can walk in off the street and say, I want to swap the arm out for a mechanical one, right? Or I don't like how it looks anymore. Give me a new one. I could see that playing out, right? I could see that being a thing because who are we to judge? It's their body, whatever they want to do to it. It's cool, right? We shouldn't get involved. It's not our business. I could see that argument being very convincing for a lot of people.
Yeah, people are going to ask us at the Catholic Church, especially priests, how far can we go? For example, eyeglasses are kind of a cyborg, right? I mean, I use glasses in order to help my vision. Okay, so to Father Alejandro's point, that improves, my humanity, so to speak. I need to see, and therefore that's a good thing. Having your arm cut off in order to get a bionic arm, even though it may enhance your performance, it will be stronger, it will be more durable, it will be more resistant. I think that and again, I think we need to think about this profoundly, but I think right now the judgment of the church would be negative. That's an unnecessary operation because I get the argument. Oh well, you're sick. You go to the hospital. You get the care that you need. That's fine. But I'm not going to the hospital to cut my arm off and have them put a bionic arm on me.
Yeah. Yeah, but
this is going to happen.
But I think you brought up the example of glasses, though. Like that's another really interesting one to me. So you're wearing glasses to correct your vision, right? So as you say, it's restoring your full humanity. This is going to be interesting in the future because we're already seeing this technology develop. But I don't need glasses. I wear them so because it helps color my vision of the world, right? The AI and it helps bring things forward. To me, it may, and this is played out in Westworld, like season 3 too. A show that we've often debated, where it allows me to analyze someone else, right? Because it runs facial recognition technology and queries the internet and gives me kind of like a full rundown, right? And so you could see like these augments, they may not be directly swapping out a piece of you. They're augments, but the augment in some ways, okay, maybe it's not directly impeding your humanity in some respects, but it may be like impeding on the humanity of others, right? Because I can't move through the street anonymously anymore because in principle, anyone wearing these glasses would know exactly who I am and know my whole story.
Yeah.
Right. And there's something weird about that. Like, there's some kind of social contract I feel is violated with that technology. And interestingly enough, and I think for the same reason I talked about earlier, we're all just seeing this technology and are amazed because we saw it in sci-fi movies and we're like, here it is. And it's cool, right? I mean, it's like super exciting to be pushing the envelope here. But at the same time, there's a lot of social like repercussions for this. And there isn't much of a discussion around that social contract. And I think it's in large part because our government feels to be, focused on important problems right now, right? And so who's got time to discuss the social contract? But I do hope that there is some kind of role, because I don't know where else this conversation is going to play out for the church in this, right? When a new technology emerges, we kind of get like a Catholic hot take on it, right? What are the issues with this? Are we cool with that? And then by educating us about the possible repercussions for this, if it plays out, then we have the opportunity to respond and say how we feel about it. And that actually may allow us to participate more in a more deliberate way in democracy, in the democratic process, ensuring that these technologies are regulated in a way that they should be, really, with the public kind of stepping up and saying this isn't what we want, as opposed to some politician who may have been lobbied, right?
And Father, I wanted to get your take on this. So I've seen this a lot being played out in conversations on X or just online in general with the transhumanists, with the acceleration, the effective accelerationists, where they'll talk about the soul of an AI. And I'm speaking specifically with Claude, where there's a number of the developers who are genuinely using the word soul when they're talking about the alignment they're working on, the evals. And there was one interesting conversation that developed online where one of the effective accelerationists was saying that essentially there's nothing different between the brain of a person, and now as a Catholic, as someone who thinks a lot about the human nature and quality that is unique to us. But they were saying in this conversation where they were saying that the computational input going through the brain is the same as going in an AI, and that essentially the brain and the machine, there is no difference. Now, we as Catholics, as spiritual beings, we know that there's a separation, but the transhumanist ideology, at least online, is very, very strong, and it has, to me, from the outside, some of the webbing of kind of a religious sentiment where they believe that I've heard the word several times where it's we're just the conduits to arrive at this next being. We're here, we're electric caterpillars, and we're going to birth AI, and I see that, and I see that played out, and it's unsettling, and I'm not exactly sure how to respond to it. What do you say to these, incredibly important and, people who have a lot of impact, a lot of effect, and they seem to have quite disregard for all the ineffective aspects of humanity that are sometimes often what makes us beautiful and what makes us.
Yeah, I think you need to distinguish. Matthew and I are collaborating with some transhumanists. And who have a more moderate view about what's going on. Let me just give you a quick example. One of the most famous transhumanists is Natasha Vita-Moore. And I met with her at Panama City 2 years ago. We were invited to their convention with Ben. And, not you, but Ben Grosso. And I said, Natasha, transhumanism is kind of getting a bad name. And she says, you're right, Father. We've taken over the Transhumanist Manifesto. I don't know if you know about it, but it's kind of like the original statutes of what transhumanists believe. And she said, we completely redid it. And I said, if I can mention this, the original one was done by Nick Brostrom. And she says, we've distanced ourselves from that. And I said, well, I'd be happy to help get the word out because there's a big distinction. She has an organization called Humanity Plus, whereas ours is Humanity 2.0. A lot of people think that we're transhumanists, but we're not. Hers is with her husband Max Moore. It's called Humanity Plus, and there is a lot with which we can agree upon. With the new version. And she says, Father, go to our website, look at the new version of the manifesto, and let me know what you think. And I did, and it's much different. It's much different. So I think there are transhumanists and then there are transhumanists. And I think that there are some, there's even a group of Christian transhumanists at the University of California at Berkeley. And they did a monographic issue of their scientific journal at UC Berkeley on transhumanism, Christian transhumanism. And they actually, one of the first essays was that Dante was the first person to ever use the term in the Divine Comedy. Transhumanist. So there's a lot that we can save with the movement. Now, the exaggerated ones, and I could name names, but I'm not going to. But there are, the exaggerated people that are very dystopic, and they're trying to say that we're headed for this kind of reality, but I don't think it'll play out. Remember that transhumanism is a philosophical movement because we're not there yet. The technology isn't there. A friend of mine teaches in Rome. you can edit out the names later, right? But anyway, he's a very prominent transhumanist, and one of his latest book is called "We Have Always Been Cyborgs." Now, this is an interesting theory. We have always been cyborgs. And I think that, like we just talked about with Matthew right now, that the idea of cyborg is going to become more and more common. We're going to merge with the machine. Now, I think that we have to do this in the right way. Some people even say that if an alien were to come on Earth, they would be convinced that a cell phone is part of our body, because you just always are going to see someone with a cell phone in their hand. It's not. But what happens when the device is inside of us? Neuralink, but there are other. Robert Knight at Berkeley is doing experiments on this as well for people with epilepsy, and he's actually doing amazing work. He has a center there at Berkeley, and he teaches neuroscience. So let me to your point about what's happening in a computer and what's happening in a brain is the same thing. This is called functionalism, and it was very popular in the 1990s as a philosophical point of view. The most famous philosopher to ascribe to that was Hilary Putnam, but it's been overcome. You know, it's been over. Nobody in philosophy subscribes to functionalism now, which is why I suggest that people at Google and Microsoft and Meta should actually take philosophy courses, because then they would realize that we tried this theory that the brain is just simply the same as an AI, but it's not. And John Searle, the famous philosopher who has dealt with this since the 1990s, has a thought experiment, and that is replacing a neuron in your brain with a computer chip that has the same functions. Okay, you have a group of neurons that are dead or that they don't work anymore. Oh, well, then we'll go in there and we'll replace them with a chip, which will have the same function, and the brain will keep working. And then John Searle, you know where he's going with this. What happens when you replace all the neurons in the brain with a computer chip? Is it still going to be a human brain? And the answer, of course, is no. It has to be a biological organ.
I just watched an episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine that actually played that out. It's crazy. Like, it's like, what, 20 years ago, and they were actually covering this topic.
Well, talk to neuroscientists. They'll tell you that a computer chip will never perform the same functions as a neuron. Now and these people study this all the time. They know what a neuron does. They know how it acts and reacts within the brain, etc. And axons, I think they're called.
But Father, then why is it that in the AI space there are so many people who, is it a utopian vision where they genuinely, or at least they say publicly that they genuinely believe that we're going to arrive at that point?
Because they have never read Hilary Putnam, who in his book, what's it called? Realism with a Human Face. He has an essay, and I taught that in my course for many years, where he asks for forgiveness about ascribing to functionalism. He said, in the 1990s, I was a functionalist and I promoted it, but now I'm not. And I'm not embarrassed to say I changed my mind, which for a major philosopher like him, he taught at Harvard University for over 30 years, is a big thing. And that's just because he's an honest person. He says, I subscribe to functionalism. I thought that the brain was basically doing the same thing as a computer, but it's not. It's very, very different. So every chance I get, when I talk to programmers or technicians at Silicon Valley, I say, you guys need to brush up on your philosophy. I say it in a nice way because I don't want to sound arrogant, but these are very deep questions.
This is very deep questions. Ben, this is one of the problems, I think, with transhumanism, and there are many, is that unlike the Catholic faith, where we have kind of a core doctrine, right, and we have a magisterium which formally articulates, the teachings of the Catholic Church, there is no such thing for transhumanism, right? I mean, what is transhumanism? Depends on who you ask, right? It's highly subjective, and this is one of my big concerns about transhumanism. is that the transhumanist agenda is ultimately going to be determined by those with power, right? Because those with power will have the ability to affect it, right? So, and I don't want to name names because I don't want to be unfair, but most of the major technologists right now, some of the top people in AI and some of the wealthiest people in the world have basically shared very transhumanist takes, right? And so I think it's fair to assume that the vision of the future that they see for humanity is one where, in some ways, we transcend this biological construct, right? And we replace it with some kind of immortal one, right? This is nothing new, obviously. I mean, this is something that, I think humanity's always tried to figure out is, how do I escape the mortal coil, and how do I be more like God, right? I think this is one of the things that concerns me, right? Is that's ultimately, I think, what the project is about. Is I reject that there is a God, and therefore, when I die, there's nothing. So that's not good. So I better figure out a way not to die, right? And I think in some ways that's completely understandable, right? But we know it's as Catholics we know it's not true, but it's also going to be a fool's errand because eventually they're going to die one way or the other. And so delaying that, you can understand why they've been motivated to do so. But what is the cost, right, of that project? And the weird thing about it is, even in Hollywood, right, they've played this out many times for us. It never ends well. Right. I mean, just to think about Westworld, right? Westworld played this out beautifully, right? And in the end, in Westworld, it's a fool's errand. It's a waste of time. Should have focused more of your time and energy in building proper relationships, life-giving relationships, and committing your time and energy to things that truly mattered, instead of trying to cheat death. And there's another show that came out, Altered Carbon, that played this out as well. People were living hundreds of years. But you could tell that there's a deep poverty in their souls, right? They were just kind of chasing really dopamine hits, right? And of course, because those wear off, you have to keep upping the ante, and they really become kind of really ugly human beings. And so, I don't blame people for chasing immortality, especially if they don't believe that there's a loving God, right? But I think we all have to be honest about how that's going to play out and what civilization is going to look like if that vision wins out. If that's ultimately the good that we're going to be pursuing as a civilization, is to find ways to extend the human lifespan. I think we'll live longer and be a lot more impoverished for it. And again, this is why I think it's so important that the church win at this evangelization mission and show people that there's another path which is far more life-giving. And ultimately, if they knew how life-giving it was, I think everyone would opt for that.
I want to ask two final questions, Matthew. As we try to progress towards that kind of, that more optimistic human flourishing future, we need to talk about AI alignment. And, as Catholics, we of course have a clear idea of what the good is and what that would look like. But can you speak a little bit on AI alignment and how you see that?
Sure. I mean, I'm speaking broadly, the whole kind of AI alignment project, right, is we want to make sure that these AIs that we're developing understand human beings and share kind of a similar value set, right? In principle, you want the AI to be an agent of human flourishing and not an impediment of human flourishing. So that's essentially what they're trying to do with alignment. It's proven to be an extremely difficult project. And one of the reasons is because alignment to what? To whose values? To whose understanding of human flourishing? This is very difficult, right? And so, of course, and nobody really wants an AI lab answering this question for us, right? In principle, this is something that should be very broadly discussed, and we should all have input on. And so a lot of this, what was started as, I think, a very kind of noble project, has been basically abandoned because they just recognize getting consensus around values is going to be difficult. And so what the alignment project has become increasingly about truthfulness within the model. How do we ensure that when we're training the model and we evaluate it, that it's being honest with us? So that's becoming one major focus. Elon Musk would say, as far for the alignment project to truly succeed, it has to go one step further. We have to teach these models to kind of like humanity. They have to be curious about humanity, right? Because ultimately, if these AIs do achieve some degree of awareness, right, in the sense they have their kind of own drives, which in some ways is probably inevitable, right? I mean, you want to ensure that those drives aren't going to be at odds with ours, right? And if they feel like propagating themselves, right, making more AIs is a priority of theirs, and we end up competing with them for energy, this could be a problem, right? So And so you wouldn't want the AI to say, well, I need all the energy, so unfortunately I'm going to have to like kill everyone, right? To make space for all my power plants. And so, but if the AI is, thought to be curious, then, it wants to see how the human project's going to play out. So it's not going to do that, right? So anyway, so that's what AI alignment is about. But I think that the Catholic Church has a critically important role to play in alignment. And I'd say that the first role is just allowing the church, which has been studying the human condition longer than any organization on earth. So I would say the church is the greatest expert on the human condition. Should have a seat at this table, right? Should have the ability to kind of weigh in and to this conversation. And I find it rarely is provided that opportunity. That's a problem, right? And I don't think it should just be the church. There should be other people involved. So that may be the first thing that I would say. The second thing is with these AIs is, we have this process called post-training, in which we kind of shape a personality, for these models. And I've been asking myself, a lot lately, if these AIs become super intelligent, right? In some ways become all powerful in kind of a worldly sense. You'd want to hope that they're a model off someone, right? They kind of have a personality or disposition or outlook on life that you respect, right? You trust, that would never harm another person, right? And right now, I do not get the sense that the personalities of these models, I mean, if anything, they're not very interesting, but they're also prone to being completely schizophrenic and whack, right? So I don't think that they're effectively doing much on this. And what I kept coming back to is, who would be a personality, like an example of someone who is all powerful, but who just was not a threat, who you could love and trust, right? And everyone knows where I'm going with this, like Jesus Christ. I mean, right? There's one figure, right, that you're modeling an AI off of that you just wouldn't have to worry about. It's Jesus Christ, right? And I think actually a lot of people in AI, even ones at top AI labs, would probably be like, yeah, that's actually, I'd be cool with that, right? So I think that's also important, right? I think we have to be seriously, considering this, because these AIs are trained on human data. At least for the time being, we're heavily dependent on human data, and that human data shapes the characteristics of the AI. We have the ability to kind of focus those AIs so that certain attributes kind of rise to the surface. And I think this is why this is a very important conversation.
I love that. And Father Philip, for the final question, I want to follow in on what Demis Hassabis and the other leaders in the AI space have been asking you. What is the meaning of life?
Well, I can't top what Matthew just said. It kind of brings us, all the complete cycle back to Jesus Christ, because that has to be the center of the Catholic Church and of the Church's message. I guess some people would follow up by saying, which Christ? Which Jesus? Because in the Gospels, Jesus Christ is very, very complex. There's a lot of facets to his personality. But I think that there were two things that are dominant, and then I'll get to your question. One is to do the will of his Father. How many times does he say, I'm here to do the will of my Father? So that's, I think, the principal lesson. And the second one is what Matthew said, love one another as I have loved you. His fundamental message is one of love. I mean, that's why he did what he did, out of love, and to obey his Father. So you can never take that away from the equation. So if we all learn to imitate him on that, I think the world would be a wonderful place. If, people are starting to ask the big questions of life and of existence, and this conversation, I think, has brought that to the forefront. And the beauty of the Catholic Church is that it has maybe not all the answers, but it has the content which satisfies human beings in their deepest desires and in their most profound questions. So the Catholic Church is how can I say this? It's like the best kept secret out there. We have what humanity requires, what humanity needs, and I think perhaps it does. We haven't presented it in the right way. Perhaps we tend to put ourselves first before God and before Christ. Perhaps we present Jesus in a way that's not him. It's not realistic. and so people don't believe in it. But one of my parishioners said to me once, Jesus sells himself. Just give us Christ, and that's all you need. That's all you need. You don't need anything else. And I think that's a great truth. So that it's going to be more necessary in the near future than ever.
Beautiful. Father Philip, Matthew, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.